At first glance, it looks like a toy, not a real gun. Its aluminum and fiberglass body weighs a shade more than 8 pounds, measures barely more than a yard, and when fired, has a recoil so gentle, a 12-year-old could handle it. Appearances here are most definitely deceiving. This gun's destructive power is undeniable. Though the M16 became famous as Vietnam's gun, weapon designers had played with the concept of a lightweight, high-powered automatic fire weapon since at least the 1940s. But for the better part of a decade, it remained little more than a good idea. Then, in the 1950s, severe setbacks in the early days of the Korean War forced the United States to seriously rethink the nature of the combat rifle.
In Korea, there was just these human wave attacks by the Chinese. The Chinese suffered 1 million casualties in Korea, mainly inflicted by artillery, but certainly a lot by small arms. But when you have hundreds and thousands of Chinese coming up a hill at you, you want firepower.
American infantry soldiers in Korea didn't have that firepower. They were armed with World War II weapons, the Garand M1 rifle and the M1 carbine. Though the Chinese were also armed with older weapons, the M1 and the M1 carbine were no match for the Chinese onslaught. The highly respected M1 rifle was semi-automatic, fed by a clip that held 8 .30 caliber cartridges and had a kill range of 1,000 yards. But a soldier with an M1 could fire a maximum of about 50 aimed shots per minute, not nearly enough for Korea. The M1 carbine with its pistol cartridge was even less appropriate.
There are instances in Korea, particularly in the wintertime, where people get a lot of clothes on, of Marines and soldiers shooting Chinese soldiers, them getting back up, dusting themselves off and coming on because the round would not penetrate their clothing.
The kind of close combat fighting soldiers experienced in Korea dramatized the need for a gun like the M16, a much lighter weapon, a weapon that could compensate for a gunner's inaccuracy by firing a spray of bullets at a shorter range, say 300 yards. But that idea violated one of the American military's favorite and most enduring myths. According to popular legend, it was expert American sharpshooters who helped defeat the British during the Revolutionary War. The Minutemen took out their targets at long range. One shot, one kill. That proud myth was bolstered during World War I by the legend of Sergeant Alvin York. He apparently tricked the enemy by imitating the call of a turkey. When the German soldiers poked their heads out of the trenches, Sergeant York picked them off, one by one. The idea of a lone marksman with a heavy caliber long-range weapon, almost single-handedly defeating the enemy, lasted until 1950. It was then the Army did a groundbreaking study on exactly how the infantry fights.
It was probably the first time that a systematic study was done on how infantry riflemen engage targets in the field. We didn't really have the kind of information to indicate that until the Korean conflict, probably.
During the 1950s, William Davis was chief of the Small Arms Branch at the military's Aberdeen Proving Grounds, the facility for testing infantry weapons. According to new studies, most soldiers held their fire until the enemy was within 200 yards. The average soldier waited until the enemy was 120 yards away. At that distance, the kill ratio dropped significantly, even for expert marksmen.
You can argue either that the opportunities did not present themselves very often, or that troops tended not to fire at targets that they considered beyond their effective range.
Whatever the reason, the facts were clear. A long-range rifle was unnecessary. Despite the new study, few of the old hands at Army Ordnance wanted to give up the myth of the lone marksman. So, they compromised.
New weapons for the American infantrymen are tested at Aberdeen Proving Grounds. The new Standard rifle features interchangeable barrels that enable it to replace the old carbine, the Garand M1, the submachine gun, and the Browning automatic rifle.
They called it the M14. It was essentially an M1 with a 20-round magazine hooked underneath. The M14 boosted firepower, but it had a definite downside. In the full automatic mode, a soldier's aim was true only for the first shot.
The problem with the M14 is the recoil. And if I go fully automatic with the M14, the first round is going to be dead on. The second round is going to be over your head, and the third round is going to be way over your head. And anything after that, the gun's going to be an anti-aircraft gun.
Nevertheless, in semi-automatic mode, the M14 was a distinct improvement over the M1, and inventories were low. The Army needed more guns, and fast. The M14 was the Army's only practical option. It was about to become the military's next official weapon when it got some unexpected competition. A futuristic-looking gun called the AR-15, the weapon destined to become the M16. To win that contest, the AR-15 would have to go to war, not against a foreign enemy, but against Army bureaucracy.
In 1884, Hiram Maxim invented the Maxim gun, the first automatic weapon, later to be called the machine gun. The M16 will continue on Modern Marvels.
Just about everyone in the world knows the name Samuel Colt. He created the Peacemaker, the six-shooter that tamed the Wild West. Many know the name John Browning. He invented three of America's most successful military weapons, including the Browning automatic rifle. Few people, however, even gun fanciers, know the name Eugene Stoner, the father of the M16.
Eugene Stoner was a genius, an engineering genius of the first order.
Stoner was probably the most gifted small arms designer since Browning.
In the early 1950s, Stoner was the chief engineer and designer at a startup gun company called Armalite, a division of Fairchild Aircraft. One of his first innovations was using new lightweight materials from the aircraft industry in his designs. Plastics that were impervious to the elements and came in a rainbow of colors. Fiberglass and stronger anodized aluminum alloys. Eugene Stoner died in 1997. In 1988, he was interviewed by the Smithsonian Institute.
I think my aircraft background experience allowed me to get into some of these lightweight materials. For instance, forged aluminum receivers, which are rather unknown at the time in weapons, but it was nothing particularly new to what I've been doing all along in the aircraft equipment and the fiberglass and all that.
Eugene Stoner and the Armalite Company got the Army's attention with some of his earliest designs, particularly for a lightweight rifle designated the AR-10. It weighed only 7 pounds and was capable of shooting 20 rounds of powerful, long-range 7.62 millimeter bullets. In one test, however, a bullet split the barrel of a prototype, exploding out the side and missing the shooter's hand by inches. Though the AR-10 showed great promise, conservative Army Ordnance officials chose not to develop it further.
They were unimpressed with it. It was just too new. And again, this thing about the M14 worked. So why change?
My opinion is that they had to get the M14 in production because they had to feed Springfield Armory and so forth. You know, there's always that consideration. So they touted the M14 as being the answer to a family of weapons. It was supposed to take the place of the M1 rifle, the carbine, the grease gun, you know, the .45 caliber submachine gun, and the BAR. Everybody who was in the business knew it was only going to take the place of the M1 because It had to fire it full automatic. There was hardly anyone that could handle it. They always made very favorable demonstrations with it because they had people that were very, very highly trained firing the thing full automatic fire, and they could put on a pretty good show. But when they tried to give it to ordinary troops, it was just useless.
Though Army Ordnance had turned down Stoner's designs, his guns had impressed someone with influence, a four-star general, William Wyman. In 1957, he paid a surprise visit to Armalite's plant in Hollywood, California.
And he just came in almost unannounced with a whole entourage and said, hey, how would you like to get in on a rifle program for me? And I said, well, tell me about it.
With Wyman's blessing, Eugene Stoner transformed his radical concepts into a brand new weapon. It was called the AR-15. It was a gun with a special destiny, a gun which would ultimately become the M16. This sexy space-age marvel was primarily made of fiberglass and aluminum. Only the barrel and a few other parts were steel. It could fire a magazine of 25 bullets, either semi-automatic or fully automatic. The AR-15 was powered by an ingenious gas system that siphoned gas from the exploding charge out of the barrel, then sent its power back down a gas tube to force the bolt carrier to the rear. That ejected spent cartridges, making room for fresh ammo to pop up from the magazine.
This is the original AR-15. As you can see, it's rather small. It weighs around 5 pounds. Right about 5 pounds. The distinguishing characteristics are that this portion here is called bakelite. It's an artificial material, very fragile, however. You can break this very easily. And then it has a three-pronged flash suppressor up here in front, but as you can see, the barrel is very, very, very thin. It's also a fully automatic weapon, but this is flimsy, and it needed to be soldier-proofed.
The ammunition itself was another innovation. The AR-15 used .22 caliber bullets. Small caliber bullets couldn't fly as far or hit long-range targets as hard as the large caliber bullets the Army preferred. Nevertheless, they offered an important advantage.
As I recall, the M14 with 100 rounds of ammunition was sort of a standard combat load, and it weighed, I think, about 17 pounds, something on that order. Whereas an AR-15 could carry 280 rounds of ammunition, or nearly 3 times as much ammunition for the same combat load, and that was probably the most significant thing about the AR-15 system.
Despite the AR-15's potential, Army Ordnance, headed by Dr. Frederick H. Carton, did not order Stoner's gun. It was believed Carton didn't like outsiders developing Army guns, and he didn't like small caliber weapons.
There's a strong feeling among some people at that time that a reduction in caliber and power of the infantry rifle was a step backward.
Some AR-15 advocates believed Carton was looking for any excuse to eliminate the new gun from contention.
He was a pragmatist, I should say, who was cognizant all the time of the political aspects of the Ordnance Corps, the decisions that were made on small arms. He felt that a worthy end would justify the means in general, and sometimes he and I did not agree on that philosophically.
They were trying to protect their turf. So they really didn't say much. They didn't say anything hardly against it, but there certainly wasn't anything for it. They just thought, like I say, that this was just a passing fancy, that the Army would go back and settle down and take the M14.
However, the AR-15 still had its champions. In 1958, General Wyman ordered the Army to give the AR-15 its first series of official tests.
I first saw it when it was sent to Aberdeen Proving Ground for trials in 1958, I think, and I was favorably impressed. We did not find in it any characteristics, any disadvantages, shortcomings that we felt could not be overcome in the normal course of development.
However, during a round of Army tests conducted in the Arctic that same year, the AR-15 failed badly, chalking up a high rate of inaccuracy and malfunctions.
I think if you look into it, what you're going to find is that the testing wasn't quite fair. They were, in fact, rigged to make the M16 or the early AR-15 look bad.
Stoner immediately flew to the test site to investigate.
The sights, which are held on with taper pins, which is no reason for them to ever be disassembled, had been taken off the weapons, and pieces of welding rod and things were stuck in their place, which meant that the parts were misaligned. It couldn't make the gun couldn't function properly. You certainly couldn't hit anything with them.
According to Stoner, it was another example of the Army's hostility toward the AR-15. In his 1988 interview, Stoner said that while he was at the Arctic site, the commanding officer dressed him down.
He says, "I think you're doing a great disservice to the United States Army." And he says, by bringing along one of these small caliber weapons, which is going to be a danger to every American soldier that carries one, and he says, "I can't wait to get your ass off this base as soon as you can get this thing settled. Please leave."
The military in general tends to be conservative because they're dealing with technology which can kill our own people instead of the enemy if you're not careful. So I mean that there is a sound basis for that conservatism, but often the conservatism goes a little overboard. And this is what happened with the light caliber infantry weapon.
Despite praise from Bill Davis and other weapons experts, Army Ordnance dropped all interest in Stoner's new gun. In 1958, Frederick Carton, head of Ordnance, wrote in his official report that the AR-15 had not demonstrated sufficient technical merit and should not be developed by the Army.
I thought it was a very bad decision because I thought the weapon showed great promise and it certainly needed further development.
The AR-15 seemed finished as a U.S. military weapon. The gun that would be the M16 would have to wait 2 years to fight its next battle, this time at a 4th of July picnic at a Pennsylvania farm.
In the mid-1960s, Mattel sold a realistic toy version of the M16 rifle. This helped fuel a popular belief among American soldiers in Vietnam that their weapons were made by the toy maker. The myth continues even to this day. The M16 will return on Modern Marvels.
Even though the U.S. Army had turned down the AR-15, Colt Patent Firearms Company bought the rights from Armalite. They started aggressively marketing the AR-15 around the world, billing it both as a sporting gun and as a military rifle. The company got some unexpected help from Air Force General Curtis LeMay, one of the most controversial, outspoken, and powerful men in Washington.
I should say probably General LeMay was instrumental more than anyone else in getting the attention of the military to the AR-15.
In the summer of 1960, General LeMay went to a 4th of July picnic hosted by representatives of the gun industry. A Colt salesman set up 3 watermelons at 50 yards, 100 yards, and 150 yards. Then he handed the general an AR-15. General LeMay thought the AR-15 would be perfect for defending Air Force bases. He ordered 80,000 on the spot. Congress, however, put LeMay's order on hold. The country was at peace. Why spend money on war? Seven months later, in January of 1961, Dwight D. Eisenhower handed over the office of president to John F. Kennedy.
Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, to assure the survival and the success of liberty.
Those words would be put to the test sooner than expected. Eisenhower also handed Kennedy a growing problem in a faraway country called Vietnam. At that time, there were about 700 American advisors in Vietnam training South Vietnamese soldiers. Through roundabout channels, the AR-15s Colt had been selling in the private sector had found their way into military hands.
There was an Army research operation that bought like, 750 or 1,000 of the weapons and tested them in different ways in different places. And amongst the places they tested them were in Vietnam, where we had military assistance people advising the Vietnamese, and they put some of these weapons into the hands of a Ranger battalion in Vietnam, and the Rangers used them under combat conditions. They thought that this weapon was the best thing they'd ever seen. So it began to get introduced a bit at a time and informally outside the regular procurement process, and the more that it got used by troops, the more troops liked it.
The gun's lightweight and full automatic capability made it ideal for jungle fighting.
Combat in Vietnam was largely what the military calls meeting engagements. And indeed, this is very common for the infantry. Meeting engagement is where you bump into the enemy, not expecting the other guy. The second most common form of combat is the ambush, where the other guy bumps into you, but you know he's coming. In both cases, you have the element of surprise. In a meeting engagement, both sides have the element of surprise. So whoever gets out the most firepower first will win.
Word of the AR-15's popularity in Vietnam got back to Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. He and his crew of Ivy League-educated, computer-savvy assistants known as the Whiz Kids were immediately intrigued.
McNamara and his people decided they wanted that weapon. They looked at the history of it, decided that this was fundamentally a good weapon, that the special uses it had been tested through in Vietnam and elsewhere showed that this was an incredibly good weapon. They knew that the Army Ordnance people were dragging their feet, and therefore they just said, let's move this weapon.
McNamara was a former executive at Ford Motor Company and a firm believer in the beauties of mass production.
Robert McNamara started asking basic fundamental questions like, why does every branch of the service wear different shoes? Why can't you have one pair of shoes and save the money? Why do you wear different uniforms? Why do you fly different airplanes? Well, there's some very good reasons why the services fly different airplanes. You can't find a very good reason why everybody shouldn't wear the same shoes. But he also asked the same question about weaponry. Why can't everybody have the same weapon?
He's Secretary of Defense. He says you will produce this weapon. You will distribute this weapon to the troops. The Ordnance Corps had no choice at that point but to salute and say, yes, sir.
McNamara ordered the Army, Air Force, and Marines to do something unprecedented. He ordered them to cooperate. Get the AR-15 combat ready as quickly and efficiently as possible. One gun for all.
Those of us who had occasion to cover the Pentagon couldn't help but be impressed by the determination of McNamara and the people under them to do what they thought was right, correctly or otherwise, to cut through the legendary military red tape.
It was a good idea, in theory.
The ordnance and weapons people thought they knew how to run a weapons program despite the historic difficulties that ordnance had in developing a really effective small arms and rifles. And the defense community that Secretary McNamara personified thought that they knew what to do and that the Army Ordnance people were obstructionists. Neither side would bend over backwards, and so accommodation just wasn't a word that got used in those days.
Consensus was very hard to come by. Even when the various armed services agreed, they were often overruled by McNamara's whiz kids. Though the whiz kids had little previous experience with weaponry, they made all the final decisions.
They tended to have a great deal of confidence in their own intellectual superiority, and they tended to have an attitude which I can only describe as arrogant.
Those guys were really computer-oriented. They were numbers crazy. And you can argue that the war in Vietnam was run by the numbers. For instance, if you expended X amount of ammunition, you were expected to kill Y amount of folks. It was stupid. It was ridiculous. It was dumb.
McNamara's whiz kids argued with the military over 130 proposed changes to the AR-15, which would soon be renamed the M16. Several of those changes would prove problematic.
This is the M16A1, which is the rifle that was used in Vietnam. The distinguishing characteristic is this forward assist, which is right here on the rifle. It had a 20-round magazine. The troops never put more than 16 in because of the spring here in the magazine would wear out, so you didn't want to do that. Notice that it has a left and a right hand grip up here, and it also has a three-pronged flash suppressor, but if you notice that this barrel is considerably thicker than the one in the original AR-15 rifle. The other thing about this weapon is that it has a selector switch that right now it's in safe, right here is semi-automatic, and right there it's fully automatic.
The new M16 was different from the AR-15 in one other significant way. The kind of gunpowder used in the M16 cartridges was switched from stick powder to ball powder. Ball powder gave the M16 a little more of the long-range capacity that the Army so loved. While the development of the M16 continued, American involvement in Vietnam escalated. By mid-1962, the number of American advisors had jumped from 700 to 12,000. Soon, those advisors would leave the sidelines. Full-out combat was just ahead. By 1963, the AR-15 had been fighting its way through the Army ordnance system for 5 years, and the need for the gun was becoming increasingly clear. In May of that year, the crisis in South Vietnam intensified dramatically. South Vietnamese President Ngo Dinh Diem alienated the Buddhist majority and the world by attacking temples and shooting anti-Diem demonstrators. Buddhist priests burned themselves alive in protest. The North Vietnamese communists gained territory all over the country, and the number of American advisors reached 15,000. In late October 1963, mutinous South Vietnamese generals staged a coup against President Diem. The next day, he was murdered, just 3 weeks before John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. August 2nd, 1964, North Vietnamese gunboats engaged an American destroyer, the Maddox, in the Tonkin Gulf. In March of 1965, the first official U.S. combat troops were deployed in Vietnam. More soldiers would be on their way, and all of them needed guns. The M16 was finally going to war. In January 1966, there were 200,000 American troops in Vietnam. By year's end, the number had doubled. The M16s were now in full production. At the peak, 45,000 guns came off the Colt assembly lines every month. During the summer of 1966, the M16 was issued to the troops at large for the first time. Only a few months later, soldiers started reporting malfunctions.
They were jamming in combat, in the jungle, in defensive postures. The weapon would jam.
When you had these stoppages, the only way you could get the thing to work again was to quite literally tear it down and clean it right there on the battlefield. And in the middle of a firefight, it's not a good idea to tear your weapon apart, particularly one that has all the little parts of the M16 rifle at night. So naturally, you're going from an M14, which would work, to one that you have these problems with, and of course the troops hated the thing.
Many of them had gotten the weapon at the last minute, hadn't been sufficiently trained on it, had been told to go out on their perimeters and fire some blasts off into the jungle, and that was the most exposure they'd gotten to the weapon. They didn't have training.
Though every gun in history has required careful maintenance, troops were told the M16 was the exception. It was self-cleaning. Cleaning kits weren't even issued. The result? Dirty, gummed-up guns. Supply stations in Vietnam started getting calls for an emergency resupply of both ammunition and rifles. Ted Reno, then a maintenance officer, remembers one night in particular.
They said, we need X amount of ammunition and 21 M16s, which kind of red light goes on. You've got 26 non-operational weapons that they want to replace. And of course, later on, the message was, you need to check them out because there's definitely a defect in either the ammunition or the weapon.
We don't know how many troops were killed as a direct result of the fouling and the jamming problems with the M16. We'll probably never know. It's not the sort of thing the Army keeps track of for any number of reasons. But it did happen.
The troops were outraged. One soldier bypassed the chain of command and sent Senator Gaylord Nelson of Wisconsin a letter detailing the horror.
The weapon has failed us at crucial moments when we needed firepower most. In each case, it left Marines naked against their enemy. In each case, and this is no exaggeration, we take counts after each fight. As many as 50% of the rifles fail to work. I know of at least 2 Marines who died within 10 feet of the enemy with jammed rifles.
The infantry troop didn't have to see it. All they had to do was hear about it. And it hurt morale. It probably hurt morale more than it hurt anything else. Because basically, the one thing an infantry soldier cannot lose faith in is his weapon.
Congressman Richard Eichord of Missouri launched an in-depth investigation. His final report blamed the problem on the Army's decision to switch from stick powder to ball powder. Ball powder made the M16 fire at a higher rate of speed. That produced more wear and tear on the weapon. More breakdowns were inevitable, especially since ball powder burned dirtier, fouling the barrel.
And not only did it foul, but it was susceptible to moisture. So one of the standing operating procedures, at least in my unit in Vietnam, was that you would never put a round in the chamber overnight because the round would swell, and you couldn't get it out. Quite literally, the back end of the cartridge would be ripped out, and then if you got another one up in there, then you were in deep, 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 deep trouble.
Though ball powder was the official culprit, it may not have been the real cause of the M16's problems.
The principal problem was the failure to chrome plate the chamber. That was the cause of the serious malfunctions that caused the controversy in Vietnam.
The Army had known since it fought in the Pacific during World War II that chrome plating the chamber eliminates rust, corrosion, and pitting that can make a gun jam. However, McNamara's whiz kids vetoed the idea.
Their attitude was that if the gun had needed a chrome-plated chamber, Stoner would have designed it that way in the first place, and it didn't have one, therefore it didn't need one. The Army was just trying to delay the implementation of its recommendation to get on with production.
Few at the I-Court hearings understood the technicalities of weapon design and manufacture. When the finger-pointing started, few knew exactly where to lay the blame. Some said the fault lay with McNamara and his aides. For others, the buck stopped at the Army's front door.
McNamara was responsible for a lot of sins, but the M16 is not one of them. He basically turned to the Ordnance Corps, whose job is to produce the weapons in working order, and said, see this AR-15? Get a military version out in the field quickly for all the infantry troops. I mean, that's a fairly clear order. And the Ordnance Corps had the means to execute that order. They did not.
The Army started issuing cleaning kits immediately and quietly began retrofitting M16s with chrome-plated bores. Within a year, the malfunctions were largely a thing of the past. Troops who came after 1967 encountered little trouble.
I never really had a major problem with it. Every once in a while it would jam, but if you kept it clean, you know, you just disassemble it and clean it, and if you kept it clean, it worked all right.
The problems we ran at with this, I don't think were unique. Problems we run in with any new piece of equipment. I can't think of anything that's ever been fielded that was perfect.
Once the initial problems were solved with the powder and having a bolt closure on the thing and that, then it became accepted, I think. The troops liked it, and they would definitely pull the trigger.
Though its beginnings were rocky, the M16 has gone on to win praise. The M16 today is the respected backbone of the U.S. military.
Many innovative weapons, including the M16, were introduced to combat during the Vietnam War. Among these weapons were the F-4s, the Claymore mines, the AH-1G Huey Cobra, and the gunship. The M16 will return on Modern Marvels.
By the time the last American troops left Vietnam, the M16 had become one of the most heavily tested and most reliable weapons in the world. It has remained a staple of the U.S. military during action in Grenada, Haiti, and Panama. It was also highly visible during United Nations military operations in Bosnia and Somalia. During the Gulf War, the M16 took a backseat to the flashy new stealth fighters and Patriot missiles. But the maintenance lessons troops learned in Vietnam again paid off. U.S. troops used a few old soldiers' tricks to help the M16 survive blowing grit and sand that would have jammed most other guns. They used women's nylons and condoms to cover the barrels and keep them free from dirt. Other improvements have come through more traditional channels. The current M16 is no longer fully automatic. Instead, it fires a 3-round burst every time the trigger is pulled.
I like the M16 today, the A2 model. Got a very heavy barrel. It fires different ammunition from the ones we had in Vietnam. It has a 30-round magazine. And most of all, I like the fact that you can change elevation and windage on the back end of the weapon rather than on the front end. It makes it very, very accurate.
The gun itself is now somewhat heavier and uses more powerful ammunition to increase its range. It can also be equipped with a high-tech laser sight, ideal for night battles. In the future, the M16 assault rifle may be the heart of an even more high-tech fighter, the land warrior. The land warrior could carry a shortened M16 with an accessory rail. Depending on need, a soldier can pop on a thermal scope to spot enemies through their own body heat, get a bead on them with a night vision scope, and target them precisely with a laser rangefinder. A video camera can silently capture every moment of action. Even fully loaded, Land Warrior gear is light enough to let troops maneuver comfortably. The Land Warrior system will make an unprecedented amount of vital information instantaneously available, not only to soldiers in the field, but to their commanders, perhaps many miles away. The M16 is also starting to prove itself indispensable on the urban battlefield. Until the winter of 1997, Los Angeles police carried only 9mm semi-automatic pistols, 38 caliber revolvers, and 12-gauge shotguns. Quite a lot of firepower. But on February 28, 1997, those weapons left the LAPD feeling naked. On that day, the police stood their ground in a shootout with two armed robbers making their getaway from a North Hollywood bank. The robbers wore head-to-toe body armor and carried 5 fully automatic weapons, including 2 AK-47s. During the firefight, police raced to a nearby gun store for anything that could give them a fighting chance. In the end, their bravery, resourcefulness, and fortitude won the day. The robbers were killed. No one, however, wanted to see that day repeated. In September of 1997, California Governor Pete Wilson announced the state had bought 600 military surplus M16 assault rifles for the Los Angeles Police Department. The M16s may prevent the LAPD from ever again being outgunned.
I think it's an excellent weapon, good reliability, altogether the best rifle system we've ever had. There may be something out there that I don't know about, but so far as I know, there's nothing on the horizon that would justify a change.
The bottom line is everybody tried it. Everybody, without exception, liked it. Everybody uses it. The only people who use AK-47s, which are basically, surplus on the market, are revolutionaries who can't afford an M16.
It's probably extraordinary that a weapon that was a subject of so much controversy when it got introduced, and which so many people thought would be phased out or replaced because of those kinds of controversies, is still around and is still the Army's weapon of choice. And that's a tribute to something. Maybe it's a tribute to Gene Stoner. Maybe it's a tribute to the Army's flexibility in coming to understand this was indeed the weapon of the future. Who knows?
The M16's glory days may now be limited, however. In April 1998, the Marine Corps announced it is spending $8.5 million to develop the Objective Individual Combat Weapon. It will be able to fire 2 kinds of ammunition, NATO standard 5.56 millimeter and 20 millimeter high explosive air bursting ammunition. Will it truly be the ultimate infantry weapon? Perhaps. But don't be surprised if years from now, the M16 is still the military's gun of choice.